And you, Sara, you spoke about being in the Solomon Islands and participating in a funeral, for example, and someone rising in the midst of the funeral ritual and constituted themselves into a channel for the spirit of the departed person. How do you feel at that moment as a Christian and as an artist? Do you simply suspend your own Christian beliefs at that moment, or do you get into the act and try to be a part of that moment?
I don't think I would suspend my Christian beliefs, but I think that I was constantly recognizing how small they were and how ethnocentric they were. And I think in that moment I knew many of these people and I'd seen their lives at that point. And what they were saying, you know, when the person was being the medium for that person, it seemed absolutely straight and good. And so it's such a different world, and it really did humble me. It brought me out of myself, and I think that was my first. I grew up on an Indian reservation, Flathead Indian reservation, and so that showed me there were many different ways of living and being, and there's a lot of racism there. So I was then going to the Solomon Islands. I definitely, yet again, was realizing that God was a lot bigger than I thought, and he said something about humility, and I've been thinking about that, and that so often art cannot be produced or made without humility. That seems like the starting point. And I was thinking of this connection between humility and humus, which is what soil is made out of, and that I have a garden that's full of clay, and so I've been putting lots of humus in it and thinking about the root, the etymology of that word, and that they share the same root. And there's a sense in which, unless there's humility, there can be no fruit and nothing can grow. And I think all these experiences, when you go to a different culture and you learn a different culture's ways of telling story and appropriating the world, you're humbled. And I think I think that's always a good experience to have. And it's always good for one's faith to be humbled. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, no, perfectly, yes.
Meandering.
But I think, you know, I'm intrigued by the reason why I posed the question was because, again, Christianity has not always been comfortable when it confronts the complexity of culture and different ways of seeing the world. So Christian missionaries have been accused many times of going to Africa or Latin America and castrating, in a way, these cultures and butchering their cultures and imposing a worldview, not necessarily the Christian content, but just a worldview that they're bringing, a cultural construct, and Christianizing it, so there's always that complexity, that tension that Christians experience, and so.
One thing, in the Solomon Islands, in the Anglican Church, and they were one of the first missionaries to the Solomon Islands. So there's some Anglican villages, and I love what they did. Is they said, these things that you do in the dark, do them in the light. So there were these male rituals and dances, that anything that could be brought into the light was brought into the light. And it's very celebratory, and as a result, they've maintained lots of their culture because of this. And I have a story. There's a man, he's an Australian anthropologist, who was visiting the Kwaio region, and I was living with the Langa Langa in a village called Radifasu. And there's an old Kwaio priest, who's a pagan priest, whose daughter had married into the Radifasu village, and he was very happy about this, and he'd come and he'd tell stories, and the best stories were all stories about this Australian anthropologist. And he'd talk about how he would brush his teeth. I thought that was hilarious, and how he would follow people with notebooks and ask questions and write questions. And one thing, the funniest story for them was that he did not believe that the Kwaio had been cannibals. He said, no, the missionaries told you that you were cannibals so that you would recognize that you're sinners, so that you would repent and become Christian. And everyone thought that was hilarious because they're very aware that their cannibal past is very close. And everyone's laughing, and he said, but I know. And then he said, "Saque my argua," which is, "Come here, white person." So I walked over to him, and he held up my thumb. He said, because my favorite meat is the thumb. The sweetest meat is the thumb. but what I loved about that story was there was a kind of cultural imperialism on the part then of the secular anthropologist who didn't like that, the culture, this wonderful primal culture was being changed by these. So I think that there's all kinds of cultural imperialism happening, and I think the missionaries have.
I'm heading to Africa next week, and so I had a Skype call this morning with a Liberian man who's he's a pastoral counselor who's been trained in the U.S. and then he went back and he's now pastoring a church as well as trying to. They don't really have much in terms of mental health structures or offerings, and so we were talking about, what are we going to do when we gather with pastors next week? And so I'm asking him, what do you think's important? What's on your mind? These are the things that I've set. Almost everything that I offered he said, absolutely, that's really helpful. But then he just told kind of his emotional angle on it, and I thought that's totally not what I was thinking. So in some sense, the thing that I was bringing, the prescription was accurate, but there was something about being with him and hearing him that gave me a different way of looking at it. So I said to him, so the first thing we're going to do is like a one-day retreat for pastors. So it's a place for the pastors to come and to be poured into, because they give out a lot and they don't have a lot of help or resources. They're all bivocational. And so we were talking through the day, and I said, I'm kind of spontaneous, but I'd like to structure the day, in more or less this way. And could we co-preach? In other words, could we set out a text? The Elijah story, for example, after Elijah has his big victory on Mount Carmel and then he's despairing of his life, is we set out that text, and I have some things to say about it and you have some things to say about it. And we offer that together. And he said, oh, that's what I was hoping was going to happen. So there's something about the welcomes. This is my second time going to Liberia. The welcome that they have for what I'm offering, I have the tendency to devalue what I'm offering and to overreact to cultural imperialism. It's kind of a false humility. Is there are things that I know. There are things that I know, and there are things that will be helpful, and that's why I was invited to come. But then I come in and I want to say, I don't know anything, you're the expert. And they're like, no, we want you to do the thing that you know how to do. Don't not do that. But the way you do it might not match, what the need is if you're not listening while you're talking. And so that's the important thing is to go into that space and to be attentive, which I think is that.
What is that humility that you were talking about? Well, when I hear you guys, I hear a very pastoral voice on the part of all three of you, and a pastoral outlook, and a real delicate way of looking at the human dignity and what people have to offer, the artist or the producer of whatever good it is, whether it's the pastor who's preaching the sermon or the teacher teaching a class. And I've often thought that art is one of the greatest media for fostering a pastoral sensibility, if looked at through Christian lenses. My own training is in literature and Romance languages specifically. So I did my doctorate in that area and ended up pastoring a Latino congregation and not using any of the specific knowledge that I gained through my doctoral work. And yet when people ask me, well, don't you feel that you wasted all that time? I said, the best training for a pastor, actually, I would say, is the study of literature. And I thank God many times that I was able to study, literature, the novel, poetry, because it just opened my eyes to a dimension of the human condition and enabled me to appreciate so much more. Those contradictions that we're talking about. When I see a man who loves God passionately and yet is maybe abusing his wife, or not being that presence, that positive presence in their home, and the struggle that is in there. And how do I approach that? I mean, do I just consign him to hell and say, you're a villain, or how do I receive that contradiction that is in him and treat him with the complexity that he deserves? But I think that's what you find in characters, well-developed characters in a novel. They're not dark or light, all one or the other. And so when you're involved in that kind of training, you begin to see that side. And so you're more able to see what people can offer and appreciate.
Because theater takes that almost one step further with playing the other. Because when you're playing a character, you have to love that character and have compassion. And as you journey toward that character, you begin finding that you're also, in playing the other, you're playing yourself. And I find that very Christian. That there's no character that isn't ultimately me on some level that I can, that sounds very
completely
egocentric.
No.
But this idea that you really empathize.
Totally.
I think that's Christ. Like when you
gives greater insight to yourself.
Who's the artist that did the sculpture of Christ as a homeless man? He's in a blanket, but you see the nails in his feet on the bench. Do you know? And I think that sense of encountering Christ in each character as well.